Without further ado, I'm going to ask Hans-Georg to open the batting, as it were. You can tell I'm an Englishman and I'm happy with English cricket at the moment. Can't think why, but Hans-Georg, if you'd like to have your 5 minutes in the sun and give us the perspective from a regulator.
Well, thank you very much, Alastair. My perspective is probably for a regulator quite unsurprising. This opening clinical trial data looks like a benefit-risk assessment problem. And I think this is what we can all agree on. If we open up clinical trial data tomorrow, there will be benefits and there will be risks. And to us, the art and science of this is like a drug. How can you maximize the benefits while minimizing the risks? And I cannot now, in the shortness of 5 minutes, present our draft policy. You have that on the website. I think many of you may have seen it. We like to believe that we have tried exactly that, maximize the benefits and minimize the risks. And by the way, the one thing only that I disagree with Richard is we're not putting raw data into a cloud. We have a measured, controlled approach about that, but we can discuss the details. So what are the benefits that we see? Very clearly, and that may come as a surprise to some of you, I would see the major beneficiary of an open trial policy to be the pharmaceutical research-based industry, because it will make pharmaceutical research a lot more efficient than it is today. And that very much echoes what Richard has just said. Number two, it will spawn a number of new research questions that we don't even think of today. How can we better profile patients to get them to the right therapies? How can we better develop, based on retrospective big data, biomarkers? How can we better inform indirect comparative effectiveness studies without having to resort to hugely expensive head-to-head studies? So there are lots of benefits in this domain as well, new questions. And then, of course, there is the benefit that for some is most important, that is public scrutiny. And I think that is extremely important, and we welcome that. We understand that we take decisions for the benefit of patients and society, and these decisions have to be reproducible. So the data have to be out. Anybody has to have a right to reproduce our analyses and decisions. That's fine. Now, what about the risks? Well, the easiest and at the same time most difficult risk is, of course, violation of patient confidentiality. Easy because we all agree on that. I've never heard anybody in this debate say we want to give out patient identities. That's a no-brainer. The real difficulty is in how do we achieve this in practice. And that is a technical debate that we will have to have, and we have said in our policy we will spend the next year on doing that together with our stakeholders, see how can we address that in the best possible way. Then there is, and I saw that also in the document that Richard presented and you will find here in your pack, there is this laudable respect for the integrity of national regulatory systems. Now, thank you very much for your empathy, yeah, thank you. But please leave that to be our concern. We understand that if everybody could get their hand on data, there could be an uptick in false analyses, in false health scares. But we're not terribly worried. We have lived with that since the existence of drug regulation. We see that on a monthly, almost weekly basis, that someone makes a claim that this drug produces this risk, etc. Many of these turn out to be false. As I say, there may be a small uptick, but it will not be the end of the world. We have learned to live with that. And lastly, there is the concern about commercial confidences and maintaining incentives for the investment. We respect that. We understand that. If you invest, you want to reap the benefits of your investments, and we should not get in the way. Therefore, we respect commercial confidential information. But having said that, and I think this is the minor detail we might disagree on, if you look at clinical trial data, what of that is commercial confidential? I hold in hand, and everybody can have that. It's annexed to our policy. It's in the ICH website. This is the list, basically, a table of contents of what a clinical study report has in it. So I challenge anybody to tell me what of this is commercial confidential. And I'm just reading at random. Is it the inclusion criteria, the exclusion criteria, the way the trial was blinded, etc.? So it goes on for 3 or 4 pages, all table of content. we are of the view that none of this is commercial confidential. So these are our positions, basically. Everybody is welcome and is invited to please comment on our draft policy. The deadline for comments is the end of September, so there is still more than a month. And we will then, based on the comments we receive, we will then refine the policy, and as I said, in order to maximize the benefits and minimize the risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans-Georg. Is this working? Anyway, I'll shout. Does anybody have any immediate questions of clarification for Hans-Georg? Not comments on anything he said, not challenges, just something you didn't understand and you want him to make clear. No, good. You were crystal clear in your exposition as usual, so thank you very much for that. Ben Goldacre, your 5 minutes without hesitation, deviation or repetition starts now.
How fast am I allowed to talk? So I think it's very clear to me and to most patients and policymakers and doctors and researchers that doctors, patients, researchers, policymakers and payers need all the results of all the trials that have been conducted on all uses of all of the treatments that are currently being prescribed in order to make an informed decision about which is the best treatment to use in any particular single circumstance. Individual doctors and patients, of course, may not look at detailed technical documents, but what they do look at are summaries produced by various people like Cochrane, like regulators, like NICE, and occasionally we will see reasonable disagreement between those summaries, as we have always seen in the scientific literature. I co-founded a campaign called All Trials, which has now got the support of over 50,000 individuals, all the Royal Colleges and faculties and societies and so on in the UK, plenty in Europe and around the US. And we ask for three things. We ask that all trials, including retrospectively, are registered so we know they happened, that summary results are made available, and that the clinical study report is made available so that we can see the real meat and drink of exactly what was done in the trial. And it's important that we do get hold of clinical study reports because there can often be methodological shortcomings in the design of a trial, which means that it is no longer quite such a fair test as one might think, which are glossed over in the brief reports that are published in academic journals or even on regulator websites. Then, lastly, after those three elements, which I think are inarguable for public sharing, there is the question of individual patient data. And here there are obviously huge gains. You can do subgroup analyses. If we want to find out if it really is true that disease severity is associated with greater efficacy on SSRI antidepressant drugs, the way to do that is to look at individual patient data. It gives us the most accurate point estimate of the benefits of a treatment, and there's nothing new about it. So the Early Breast Cancer Collaborative Trialist Group, for example, have been pooling data on breast cancer treatment for almost 2 decades now. We don't have any of the things that I've just set out. For registration, if you look at all of the trials that are published in peer-reviewed academic journals and check to see if they were properly registered or registered at all, you find that the prevalence of non-registration varies, but it can be a third, a half, or 2/3 of all the trials being published even now. And that includes where trials started before registration was supposed to happen. People have still failed even to do retrospective registration. We know that for publishing results, that doesn't happen. The most current evidence on this is a paper published in PLOS just last month, which finds that about half of all trials registered on clinicaltrials.gov between 2006 and 2009 still haven't posted results 3 years out. This is consistent with what we know from the most current review on this, which is the HTA 2010 review, which finds that overall about half of all the trials conducted in the past have not gone on to be published, and trials with positive results are twice as likely to be published as trials with negative results. Clinicaltrials.gov was supposed to fix this, but unfortunately it lacks routine open public audit. And when an audit was finally done by Preil et al. And published in the BMJ in 2012, they found that the rate of compliance with that legislation, which requires that everything is posted on clinicaltrials.gov within 1 year of completion for trials with one site in the US, for a currently marketed drug and so on, they found the rate of compliance with that legislation was 22%, 40% for industry, 10% for mixed industry and academic. Since then, there's been a sort of bizarre circus where people have tried to contest that. So NIH have done a back-of-the-envelope calculation saying it's roughly 50%. People in industry are throwing around a slide presentation that somebody from FDA gave at a closed meeting a year ago that says the compliance rate is 2/3. The very fact that there is any discussion about the rate of compliance with this shows that it has failed as a piece of legislation, because you cannot meaningfully have a piece of legislation and an information structure like clinicaltrials.gov that is supposed to deliver transparency without having routine audit. What that database needs is a simple variable that says, should this trial have reported its results on this date or not? And we know from conversations that we've had around the world that industry has lobbied hard to have that withheld from the database. And lastly, and then lastly, CSRs we need. So we've heard all the bad arguments against transparency. I think it would be really useful to just go through very quickly the problems with the EFPIA documents. First of all, it doesn't go as far as the EMA draft, where almost all of the CSR is openly published, which is very good, and also data on rejected drugs is proposed to be shared, which is extremely important, especially for orphan diseases. There are huge loopholes and exemptions. It misses off-label uses, despite the fact that we know that off-label uses are highly prevalent, and it covers no retrospective trials. So the prescriptions of today are based on the trials of yesterday. We prescribe drugs today that came on the market 2, 5, 10, 20 years ago. And because this promise gets us nothing from the past, it will do nothing to improve the evidence base for the prescribing decisions that we are making today. It bundles up protocols in with individual patient data and says that people have to apply to get access to the protocol by going through the same elaborate process that you have to go through to get individual line-by-line patient data, which is clearly not proportionate. Protocols should be publicly available before a trial even begins. The panels described as independent are not independent. They're only required to be non-employees, but they can still be people with close contacts with the company. There's no routine public audit of requests and correspondence. We need to be able to see the paper trail. Who asked to get access to IPD, who rejected them, what were their reasons for rejecting it, and that's an extremely important part of any serious mechanism for getting access to this stuff. And lastly, they demand that people doing secondary analyses of trial data share their statistics analysis plan in advance. I fully agree with that, but I think we have to apply that same high standard to people doing analysis on their own data. I think industry need to share their statistical analysis plans in advance, because the risk of people doing data dredging on their own trial data is exactly the same as the risk of people doing data dredging on other people's trial data.
Thanks very much, Ben. Any questions for clarification for Ben? No? Great. Okay, well, Susanna, you've heard from the regulators, you've heard from industry, you've heard from the academic community. I mean, one thing that's been missing perhaps from this debate is the views of patients and families. I mean, from your perspective, from the European Patients Forum, how do you see the discussion about the use of clinical trials data, taking account of those perspectives?
Thank you, Alastair. Yes, obviously the mic is on. First of all, from the patient movement, we are delighted that patients are increasingly becoming active participants in their own care. That's almost a no-brainer already. And more patient involvement is also recognized as a vital element to ensure the future high quality and sustainability of the healthcare systems, despite the economic crisis. But in order to be able to implement patient-centered care and empower patients to make fully informed decisions in partnership with their health professionals, it's vital that both clinicians and patients have access to all relevant information needed to make those decisions. We already heard that estimated half of the clinical trials that have been conducted have never been published. And in fact, those with the positive results are twice as likely to be published. And since the very beginning of EPF involvement in the clinical trials debate and the directive, we have been calling for publication of the all trials information in a timely manner and regardless of the outcomes. Obviously, for patients and carers, the most important thing is usually access to results of the clinical trials, but that means that the main conclusions of the trials should be in a simple and understandable language rather than the raw data as such. But obviously for the researchers, the raw data, that is very, very important to be able to revisit the studies and reanalyze data. But it can also be in the interest of patient associations too to access detailed data. In fact, all the arguments that we have heard for data sharing, they are very, very compelling. But one has been missing from this. In fact, it's a kind of a moral imperative and demonstration of respect for the trial participants who volunteer, and they are the ones who are taking risks in trials. So the publication should be seen from that perspective as well. And in fact, it can be considered that the data belongs to the participants of the trials, is their property, and by extension of that for the wider society as well. And they cannot be, from this perspective, just owned by commercial entities or academics. Wider sharing of data can be seen to lead to significant benefits. And for example, limited resources that we all are talking about, they would be used more effectively. And there would be no duplication of research, which in fact is by definition unethical. There were a lot of talk already about how to best share the clinical data, and we also see that as a complex question, which really requires reflection between all the stakeholders. And we are obviously, and the whole patient community is totally committed to be part of that. And we are actually currently discussing with our membership what their views are on how to best share the data. We support the EMA approach to proactively publish all the clinical study reports. And but it's also very important that patients and the public, the laypersons, are given the right tools to access and interpret the data. The CRC, it's a complex document. So we are calling for effective guidance on how to effectively interpret this document. Lay summaries will be beneficial, but they should be reviewed by patients to ensure that they are comprehensive and understandable, like is happening with the EMA public documents. For us too, it seems that the way forward would be a kind of controlled access to the data, in which there are concerns about patient confidentiality. But there are several questions in this. For example, what can be considered as the legitimate purpose for access? Would that include, for example, non-medical research conducted by national insurance agencies, private insurance companies, employers? Some patients will be worried that their data...
I'm going to have to hurry you.
Yeah, no problem. That their data might end up in the wrong hands when it could result in discrimination on the grounds of health status, genetic profile, and so on. But who will control the access of data? We have heard the EMA view. We have heard the industry view. Our view is that it's crucial that patient representatives are part of a formal structure to evaluate proposals. What about how can we ensure that quality and ethical standards are used to applying to the reuse of data, including transparency of those results? What are the best de-identification solutions? to protect the trial subject personal or sensitive data, while you are still sharing the data in a format that allows research. It will be also interesting to see what is the willingness of people to participate in clinical trials if they know that their patient-level data is published. And we think that there might be some interesting things in this, both positive and negative. And it's also absolutely crucial to be able to address the implications for informed consent and data participant rights. There is currently a lot of variation in the quality of information and informed consent in clinical trials in the EU. And EPF, together with Alastair, I think, have been calling for European quality standards, including common core elements for the informed consent. That's all.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Now, before throwing it open, any questions for clarification to Susanna? No? No? Great. Well, thanks to all our speakers for laying out their positions so clearly. Now, clearly, there is no simple answer to the issues. If there was, I suspect we'd have found it a long time ago, and we wouldn't be spending an August afternoon discussing it here in Brussels. But, I mean, ultimately, just to start the ball rolling, Hans-Georg, isn't it all the regulators' fault? I mean, if you asked for the data that people like Ben are calling for, then wouldn't it be possible to do the reanalysis, the clarification that people are seeking for? Shouldn't you be more thorough in your approach to specifying the requirements that go into the marketing authorization application that would allow Ben and people like him to analyse the data?
Well, it's always the regulators' fault.
Of course.
Yeah, we know that.
But start the ball rolling with an easy target.
Yeah, no, but aside from that, no. Why would it be our fault? We have a responsibility to do the best possible job to assess the benefits risk and to act in the interest of patients and society. Now, that has nothing to do with the benefits of open data that I described earlier. The first is to promote research in future. And I don't see how that would be the regulator's task. But even if you come to that openness, and I think that is what you are addressing, if we did the best possible job in the world, why would there need to be anybody else to second guess us? Is that what you're aiming at? In an ideal world, if we were all superhumans, maybe that would be the case. We are the first to concede that we're humans. We say we get it right in the vast majority of times. But there may be cases where some outsider may say, did you perhaps overlook this? Or if you look at it differently, and you would say, fine, you have a point. That has happened in the past, that will happen in the future. We're wide open to that, and I don't see why that would be the regulator's fault, no.
Okay. Yeah, Richard.
Yes, but I think, Hans-Georg, we can acknowledge that for decades, we had a drug development model which was not very transparent, right? I used to work, before I went into policy, I worked in drug development. And, all our teams are focused on one thing, to get an approval. We go to the FDA, we go to the EMA, we get challenged all the time. We can't do any data dredging, I tell you. We pre-specified subgroups, all these things. And that has been our world, is that, EMA, FDA controls us. And basically, then all you need to do, Ben, is to hear about it from Hans-Georg, and you should be okay. Now we acknowledge that that's not enough. This is a new era, and maybe we've come slow to this debate, both the regulators and the industry. We're doing this now. We're opening this up, sharing much more information. This commitment is about doing that big time. So I think we don't have to be defensive in any way. Maybe us saying that maybe we could have done this a year ago or 2 years ago, but nevertheless, it's not too late, I think. We need to make sure, Ben, that, and we're ready to be held to account, to make sure that it won't be that complicated for you to get to see that protocol and that statistical plan, okay? You shouldn't have to go through all these review committees just because you want a document. So we're ready to listen and to make sure that the processes are manageable. And of course, it will be much more complicated if you want big data files. We have to have a discussion with you about the formats and everything. But we're ready to listen and to make sure that we have a process which is workable.
Ben, you want to?
I just think it's important to be clear that it's not new that people have wanted to have knowledge and understanding of which treatments work and which treatments work best. Medicine is not practiced solely on the binary output of the EMA. There are many, many drugs that are currently on the market that you'd have to be completely mad to prescribe. Just because something is approved doesn't mean you would want to use it. And that's why doctors and patients and researchers and payers and policymakers and everybody else need access to all that information, and always have done, especially actually for doing work on cost-benefit analysis and also comparative effectiveness. But I think the real concern here is on the details. And I'm pleased to hear that you're willing to consider, for example, releasing protocols and statistical analysis plans without having to go to the independent panels. But I'd be interested to know why it is that you think it's okay to withhold the results, not even CSRs or individual patient data, but to withhold the results and perhaps redacted CSRs on trials that were conducted and completed in 2010 or 2005. A drug like venlafaxine or olanzapine, very widely used drugs, the most widely used drugs, came on the market in the past 5, 10 or 20 years. Why can't we have access to those results for those trials that I myself am prescribing right now?
Yeah. So these principles is the baseline. Okay? So this is the baseline for everyone, and we really wanted to have one minimum standard for the entire industry. Some of my member companies have already pledged to actually open up and go back retroactively. I know we have to deal with this on an individual case-by-case basis. And I know already today that many of my member companies will actually give you that type of data for products like you mentioned. But would you touch upon the question that Hans-Georg raised earlier, which I just need to comment on, and that is, what could possibly be secret about this? You read the table of contents from a CSR. Well, I'll give you two answers to that. One is that there are increasingly products in development where we don't have patent protection. We are with the advent of personalized medicine and omics and all that. We have the head of the NIH urging the industry to go back and repurpose all the old medicines. Well, guess what? There are no patents. We need some exclusivity, otherwise we won't invest in them. We rely on something called data protection. There's a legal instrument in Europe, 10 years now for new products, you get 10 years data protection. But at the same time as the EMA is advancing these policies, the other side of the EMA, it has become much more strict in acknowledging data protection. So we have been told, one of my member companies have been told that their new MS drug, I don't think it's finally decided, their new MS drug, just because it's a known compound, they won't get any data protection. And basically patents of that nature don't work in Europe. So you have no protection, neither in Europe nor around the world in many countries where if things are available on the internet, study reports, you print them off, you go to Australia, you get an approval, there's no protection. So we need to find a way where for these products, which may not be the outlier, maybe quite a few, that we will be able to tell the EMA, this is sensitive, don't disclose this, So if we can find models for that, I think we can accommodate the concerns from the industry on commercial confidentiality.
Could I
no
just
data protection, no repurposing of drugs, to paraphrase basically what you said. Anyone want to respond to that before I let Ben back in? Yeah, okay, Ben.
It seems to me that there is a problem with intellectual property law here, and that needs to be fixed by addressing the intellectual property law rather than continuing to withhold the results of trials. You cannot keep something secret from your competitors in China and share it with me, but you have to share it with me if I'm prescribing it to patients. I cannot prescribe a drug for patients ethically knowing that information about that drug is being withheld, and that the best I have is a summary by somebody who I trust to be clueful and well motivated, but I cannot expect regulators to be perfect. The problems with Vioxx, rosiglitazone, Avandia, problems with the evidence base for Tamiflu, these weren't spotted primarily by regulators, they were spotted by independent researchers and doctors.
But you'll get all of this under this commitment. okay, going forward for new products, you will get protocol statistical plans. You're a researcher, you'll certainly qualify. You know, you'll get these under these commitments.
There's just one sort of very, very small thing to you that I would really love to hear, which is you speak as if you recognise the value of this data from 2010, 2005, 2000 and so on, but you say you cannot ask industry or force industry to hand it over. Of course you can't. But you're in a position of leadership in your industry. Could you at least say that you think it is best practice and that people should share this information?
No, what I can say is this, that I'm sure that my companies will give you data on these products where there is a debate, and they're already doing it. I know they're doing it without being forced to do it. Okay, forced, you have to stir up a certain debate, but at the end of the day, you get it. And with these principles, it's going to be much easier because you're going to have a process for it. And everyone has become comfortable, but it's taken us 6 months to become comfortable with putting out all this information, both proactively with synopsises and on request. You know, so now people are comfortable. So I think the reception you'll get from the industry after January 1st next year, also for all products, will be different from what you've seen in the past. And you please monitor. I expect you to monitor us.
Well, but better than that, I think industry needs to put in simple, clear information architecture that facilitates routine open audit. So, for example, when you say we already register all trials, we already publish all results, actually we know that's not true. And actually what we need is for EFPIA to tell all of their members that as part of their commitment, they also need to publicly audit and post and say, these are the trials we've done, this is when the results should be posted, and this is the proportion of trials on which we have failed.
Right, I think we need to move on, or we can clearly, this particular issue can run and run, but I'm going to bring in, can you say who you are, please? And is there a roving microphone there? Say who you are and who you represent.
My name is Jim Murray. I represent myself on the blog called Open Medicine EU, which I write. I wanted particularly to deal with this question of trade secrets and so on, because first, what's proposed by the industry, I'm sure it's well meant, but in the end of the day, it will actually mean a great deal will depend on which company, which medicine, which set of circumstances, and it will not bring us anything like open science in this area. And I really wanted to ask is why, you half answered it, I think, Mr. Bergström, why the industry was so much opposed to what the EMA proposed as to take them to court. As you know, companies have taken the EMA to court to block the publication of information, not to block the policy. And I understand that it has been reported that their action is supported by EFPIA and by the US Pharma Association. What's the problem? EMA wanted slightly, Alastair, going against what you said at the beginning, something which, at least in this respect, had the merit of simplicity. Publish after authorization, publish at least the CSR, we won't go further than that just at the moment, and that's it, it's clear, we know where we stand. What's the problem?
The problem is that we think that the companies are the best to judge whether that particular product has a problem with data protection, or whether the competitive situation is such that you don't want your competitor to see how you were arguing or how you were designing your study. And we think that that's core of this. This is the core of our business model, is that you must have the right to say that we don't want this to be put on the web. That's in the cloud, Hans-Georg. I take your point that maybe the raw data you will try and put in some secure environment, but all CSRs, study reports, as they are, unfiltered, unchanged, on the web for everyone to see, is going to only benefit basically competitors, is going to benefit other regions of the world that aspire to have an industry of a strategic nature like ours. Rather, we would like to see a model where researchers and payer groups and others that have legitimate requests, they will get the full reports. They will get everything they want. But we don't want to give it to the competitors or uncontrolled on the internet. And we need to find, and this will be in our response to the consultation, as you can imagine, Hans-Georg, that we want to see a serious process in which where the company's commercial interests are looked after. And that's why we have to take this to the courts. And we will continue to argue this case. This is extremely important for us.
So companies are best positioned to be judge and jury as to who should access their
On
data.
commercially
and
sensitive issues, yes.
And companies decide what is commercially sensitive.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think that's... Yep, there's a hand gone up at the back there. So, yep. We have the microphone over there. And please, can you say who you are and if you are representing an organisation?
Yeah, Laura Batchelor from FIPRA International. It's going to the heart of just what we're talking to here, my question. And it's regarding the competitiveness aspect, which Richard has raised, and regarding China. What are the implications? Has the EMA done an impact assessment? Because this is really a broad policy change. And of course, if the Commission produces policy, they have to do an impact assessment. And I just wonder how far it's been thought through as to what the implications will be when you have, companies, generic companies, for example, in Bangladesh, where the IPR legislation, which we talked about, the bar is very low. It seems to me that's one aspect which I'd be very interested to understand, the depth in which that's been reflected upon. And also, I think there's a trade secrets directive, which I wonder whether there's been reflection and consideration about whether this actually will conflict with that directive, which I think is under review as well.
So Hans-Georg, have you done an impact assessment?
Yeah, first of all, let me start with a disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not the right man to ask the final points of the legal issues. What we hear is intellectual property, data protection, and then sharing data. And what I learned from our lawyers, wait a minute, these are totally different things. We have data protection. That doesn't mean that you cannot have the data. Everybody knows that. So colleagues, let's please not confuse deliberately or inadvertently the issues. The next thing is, we've heard this for a long time, that if we let out this information here, then we will abet certain practices in other jurisdictions. Now, can I ask colleagues in the room, which jurisdiction around the globe, except the US FDA, requires patient-level data? The number is 0. So we're not changing anything at all with that. The FDA have them. They will not violate rights. And all the others wouldn't do what to do with them. So nothing will change. If we had a very open and comprehensive EPA, and for those who don't know what that is, we produce a European Public Assessment Report that should have all the details that are here in a shortened version. So if you open the EPA, you should say that the pivotal study was study number XYZ. This was a double-blind, placebo-controlled with 5,100 patients. So all that information that is in here should already be in the EPA anyway. So what we hear from a number of jurisdictions, if they came with the EPA, that is just as good. So what we say is that if we publish that, it will not make much of a difference. We had, by the way, because Australia always came up, and we were wondering. So we had evening-long, no, it was morning, it was for evening for them, we had long teleconferences with their legal department. And they said, no, we don't see that as an issue. We told them exactly that. They have our policy draft and all that. I said, no, provided you do this or that, it will not be an issue for us. So I'd love to hear what the real impact is. But in our assessment, we couldn't come up with one.
It's because you've asked the question whether it happened in the past. The Australian legislation is very clear. If you come with a full study report printed off the internet, you're qualified for applying.
Sorry, may I answer to that? No. We will not come with a full report of the dossier. The entire CSC information will not be made open. We will blacken out. If anything is CSC in here, we're happy to do it. We've said that all along. And the Australians have said, okay, if that piece is missing, then you put out the nail and the whole thing falls apart.
But didn't you just say before that there wasn't anything CCI in that document?
Sorry, we have in there a number of coded, if you look at the footnotes, where we say this could be CCI. I probably wasn't clear enough. Apologies.
As long as there's an acknowledgement that there will be things taken out of the CSRs, we have something to discuss.
So, Susanna, you want to come in on this?
I'm afraid I have a question to Richard as well. You already said that a lot of clinical trial data can be accessed already today on request. But for the benefit of the discussion here today and further on, it would be interesting to know something about how many requests nowadays companies get, by whom, some kind of idea about that, and what kind of response the companies say, if they refuse, why. I think that kind of information could be quite beneficial for the discussion already. Yeah.
That is a very good question. I'm surprised myself that we haven't done the survey yet. Maybe someone from the industry can respond, but I know for sure there are plenty of requests. They tend to be naturally from not competitors, because they realize they will not get a reply. Interestingly, Hans-Georg, I understand from your statistics, at least up until a few months ago when I saw the data on the requests, they were primarily from law firms and competitors, not from scientists. The scientists come to the industry. When you look at our commitments in detail, you will see that actually we've built it in such a way that you should not have to go to a review board for standard requests. I mean, if we know it's you or it's some well-known research group, the company itself would say, okay. It's only if there's a dispute. The company saying, oh, we're not so sure, you're not really qualified. Then you have the right to have a hearing of an external review board with the external members. Right, so that's the, and how that should work, we're all open to discuss. There is a process in the United States. Institute of Medicine has started a project with industry and everyone else on actually seeing if you can actually set up some common standards for this. So we're all interested in tapping into that discussion. Did I answer your question entirely? No, I felt there was a part of it.
Broadly, yes, but in detail, no. For example, can you give some examples of interesting cases of a refusal that would be benefit the discussion here? Like,
well, a competitor or a research group's.
I can give you an example. We've applied for IPD to do a subgroup analysis to see if patients with more severe depression do better from the drugs, and we've been rejected access to IPD. And that was an entirely legitimate clinical question. I think there's a real risk with these review panels that their deliberations and the correspondence around them will be kept secret, and so we get into a he said, she said situation. And we have to remember also, when people are making a decision about whether somebody is competent to use this information, the most recent well-documented precedent for that kind of squabble is Cochrane and Roche over Tamiflu, during which Roche argued that the Cochrane collaboration, 14,000 academics worldwide who produced more systematic reviews than any other organization in the history of mankind and effectively invented them, were told, you are not competent to produce systematic reviews, therefore we're not going to give you clinical study reports. So I think at the very, very least, all of the correspondence around people applying and being rejected needs to be firmly in the public domain.
But that's the intention. That's the intention. And we also see how far we can go to actually have some kind of common procedures or formats for this to simplify this. We're registering all these points. These are good, constructive proposals.
Does anybody from industry want to rise to the question that Richard threw out and comment on particular company experience or from? Yeah.
Oh, individual patient data.
That's right. So does anybody want to come in and rise to Richard's question? No. Right. Okay. So, but moving on. Isn't what you're asking for, Ben, just a counsel of perfection? You say how doctors need to have access to all this data, that there needs to be, a way of making these informed clinical decisions. I mean, does that happen really, or is it just a kind of nice idea that nobody really needs to go along with? They can trust what's comes out of the regulatory process.
So there are various things that frighten the public when you give them a clear explanation of how evidence-based medicine works in practice. And information being withheld by industry today is one of them. But actually, the thing that they're most baffled by is that we only invented the very notion of doing systematic reviews in the late 80s. So actually, you could be forgiven for saying, well, industry is slow to catch up, because actually nobody really competently understood the importance of gathering all the results together. It was a real cultural blind spot in medicine. But now industry are lagging behind. They very clearly are lagging behind. They don't understand that medicine is no longer practiced on the basis that you have 2 trials that hit the right p-value. We look at summaries of all the data. We do enormous and elaborate comparative effectiveness research. We do network meta-analyses. And of course there are imperfections, but why allow the very coin to be faked? Because if we don't have access to all the results of all the trials that have been conducted on all of the treatments that we're currently using, then nobody has any possibility of practicing evidence-based medicine. You pull the rug out from underneath the entire project.
But I think, Ben, I think when we've debated before, we've met before, I told you I absolutely agree with what you've written in your book and what you say about the need to invest more in data generation in the real world. Right, absolutely. And that's the whole conference we had here with IBM and Wellcome Trust was about that, real world data, you know, for better decision making, both for regulators and for payers and for prescribers. Right? But I don't think you're fair saying that we are ignorant to this, or we are slow. We have engaged on relative effectiveness with this UNETA project. We have now in IMI a project called Get Real. I love the acronym, which is about doing relative effectiveness studies already in phase 3. You know, so I think we are showing that we need. The concern I have is that we can't just add, you know, data generation post approval big time, hopefully through more automatic data mining and registries, adding that on top of these 2 bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger RCT trials, which maybe is not really answering the right question. So we need to find a rebalancing of the evidence base.
But if you talk to a patient with depression and you say, well, it's possible that we could identify a subgroup who would do better on particular drugs, and there's enough data that's already been collected at enormous cost, because the cost of running these trials is millions of dollars. So all this data already exists. The only thing preventing us having access to it and getting an answer for you that would improve your care is willing on the part of industry. The actual costs in the nuts and bolts of them handing over that data are utterly trivial.
But you know, we have a project for that. We have a project for that. We have, again in IMI, new meds. I don't know, Michelle, how many patients' data is in there. We've pooled 5-6 companies. All the depression clinical data is pooled. And these academics, SMEs and companies are working on that right now. And the fruits of that will be published so that we will know, you know, what is the real nature of this disease.
But it's a basic principle that it's shared with everyone.
Yeah. So basically
on request.
There is an issue here about enabling clinicians to establish the risks and benefits of prescribing a particular medication to a specific patient, and what's the right drug of choice in a particular case. But I mean, Susanna, I mean, patients have a view about risks and benefits. I mean, how do you see patients and patient organisations being involved in discussing the question of whether the game is worth the candle, whether the data supporting the positive advances that come from taking a particular medication are worth running the risks of an adverse event for?
The game is definitely worth the candle because, as you know, Alastair, we have been already for decades we have been discussing and calling for more comprehensive information to patients and access to not only some general information, but we need to, when you are individual patient, you need to get into the nitty-gritty. We can take, for example, patients with rare diseases. They will want to have access actually to the kind of raw data kind of information. Patients definitely have their own view always on the risk and benefit of medicines, and it's not always the same for all patients. I mean, patients may be willing to take much more risk than you can imagine, and that cannot be predefined by any researcher or anybody. You need to ask the patients themselves, and I think participants in a clinical study, they would be very much for sharing information as widely as possible if they are really explained how it's going to happen, what are the safeguards, and so on. And that's the next stage, I think, for this discussion, no doubt. Can I raise one issue which haven't been mentioned? There are some journals already who are requiring the release of raw data before they are accepting a publication from a clinical trial. I don't know how widespread is that kind of practices, and is that something that has been looked by the EMA as well? British Medical Journal, for example, is doing that.
Well, we're a bit removed from that because that is their policy. So, I mean, we can welcome it or not, but we're in a very different role. I think it's a good move and an interesting move, but it goes far broader because we're only talking about the data that we hold in hand. So it is a different issue.
Do you want to comment on journal policy in this area?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's necessarily a chat about.
So Stefan Berkman's Elsevier, I just wanted to say about that we're all for open data when it comes to at least Elsevier, mostly publishers, but we cannot be the ones who enforce actually on the scientists, on the industry to release the data. That's all I wanted to say. I mean, it's not for us to make that decision.
Okay,
but we're happy to help in any way we can actually for this data to be shared and available.
Very quickly, we're running out of time.
I think the academic publishing industry failing to take responsibility for policing the literature is actually one of the reasons we're here today. One of the greatest problems is that people switch primary outcomes, for example, in clinical trials when they report them in academic journal articles. And the prevalence of that is a third, a half, 2/3 of publications. And if peer reviewers and editors were better at reviewing protocols and registry entries, that simply wouldn't happen. So I think what characterises this whole debate is everybody failing to accept ownership of the problem, and that's why it's so great to see the EMA moving forwards.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Well, at least on the side of the industry now, with this commitment, we're going to make it possible for all medical journals to access all the information if they want for that type of scrutiny, at least from industry.
2014. Which means nothing for medicine for 10 or 15 years.
Well, we have to start somewhere. Okay, we'll start with that. And I think, with your help, I think we need to then expand it laterally. So there's not only industry-sponsored research within the EFPIA and pharma membership, but it's broader because there's all this academic research out there and other companies doing studies, which are outside of this. I think we would not have anything against, Ben, you made the point before about teeth on registries. That you start a study. Where does it end? When does it end? Top line results. We have nothing against even legislation on that.
Retrospectively?
For the not results. I mean, here we're talking about high level results and registries. Yes, but then you have to ask your question: is it worthwhile to go back? How far back do you want to go in just fixing the registries?
70% of medicines came on the market after 1990.
We're very rapidly
if you're not talking results, but just registries, we can discuss.
Yeah, we're very rapidly running out of time. We do have basically 2 minutes left, and I want to bring this to a conclusion by asking each of the panel members to wrap up their key message to the audience about this issue. I mean, what single step, what single change would you like to see that would bring about this greater transparency, this more appropriate use of clinical trial data that would help us to ensure that we continue to develop effective drugs, that will maintain public confidence in the regulatory process, and which most of all will engage patients in a healthcare system that is more likely to deliver improvements in the quality and quantity of their lives than the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. I'm going to start with you, Richard, and then I'm going to Hans-Georg and to Ben, and then to give the last word to the patients in this. So, Richard, what's your single most important next step?
Yeah, despite coming with this commitment sort of late in the debate, I would hope that our stakeholders, including our regulatory authority and the Commission, would recognize that actually this is a pretty good proposal. It's thought through. If it's made to work, it'll solve most of the needs there are. Acknowledge that, welcome that, work with us on making this work. It's going to be far less bureaucratic than any regulation can put in place. Make it work with us. We're ready to be held to account. Monitor this, track us, because we want to deliver on this.
Thank you, Richard. Hans-Georg.
Well, we have sort of progressed this by coming up with a very concrete step, and that is the draft proposal. We have made it very clear how we move forward. We hope we will get comments from all of you by the end of next month, and we will then review that. We like to believe that this is a balanced way to achieve all these aims. And if I have a wish for industry, could you please come with a concrete case? Not the usual sort of blurry thing, IP, data protection, data sharing, etc. That doesn't work. With a concrete case, how we would damage the future of drug research. We have no intention to do that because we think the future of drug research is important for public health. We all agree on that. But we don't see how it will happen. We have repeatedly asked for concrete examples. They didn't come forth.
Thank you.
I think it's impossible to say anything concrete about IPD in one sentence, but the one thing that would fix all of this is retrospective access. So we need access going back, I would say, 2 decades. Having looked at the era of approval for currently prescribed medications, we need to go back 2 decades, and we need for all trials on all uses of all currently prescribed treatments, we need the trials be registered, we need the summary results, and we need an appropriately redacted CSR with IPD removed. And I don't think there's any ethical argument against that, and patients are harmed if we fail to deliver that.
Thank you, Susanna.
I think from EPF perspective, what I would like to leave you with is that moving forward, patient involvement every step of the way throughout this debate, and developing concrete proposals, that would be a key to us. For example, the transparency is here. It's unquestionable. We are moving forward to a more transparent society, and clinical trials are part of the society. So from here on, we need to be involved in all of the steps. For example, one concrete is what is the best method for data sharing? How would that happen? And what about the privacy? And what are the best methods for de-identification? So we could move forward to concrete topics rather than talking about the principle. So patient involvement.
Yeah. Thank you. So some very interesting points come out. I'm not going to attempt to summarize it, but we hear from industry that there's a willingness for change. Question, is it a big enough willingness? Will it go far enough? Ben would like to see us looking backwards as well as forwards, and the regulators want evidence of harm. But I think most importantly is the message about engaging with patients and families to make sure that their interests are properly represented at the table at every step of the process, so we can carry the issues forward in a way which ultimately, I hope, produces the maximum patient benefit and continues to allow the industry to produce effective interventions that will address unmet medical needs. I'd like to thank all our panelists for a very stimulating discussion. And before I hand over to Duane to chair the next session, please join me in thanking our contributors for their input.